Hello everyone and welcome back to the Dungeon Learner's Guide. This week we've got another Commander's Guild deck tech. This is deck number 179 and it's titled So Simic It Hurts. And if you haven't seen this show before, what we're doing is randomly selecting a card from scryfall.com or from among suggested cards, working with a budget of $100 or less and building a commander deck for Magic the Gathering around a theme of the chosen card. So this week, our random card is going to be a completely random card. Sometimes we do have some suggested by our viewers, and if you would like to suggest a card, please do put that down in the comments below. But otherwise, our random card this week is Experiment 1. And Experiment 1 is a green mana for a 1/1 human ooze. It's got Evolve, so whenever a creature enters the battlefield under our control, if that creature has greater power or toughness than this creature, put a +1/+1 counter on this creature. And we can remove 2 +1/+1 counters from Experiment 1 to regenerate Experiment 1. So, despite the fact that this is an uncommon creature, there is a lot happening with this card. It's got Evolve, it's got two pretty relevant creature types, human especially, it's a 1-drop, and it can regenerate itself. So there are a ton of different things that we can do when we're building this deck. And so I really was kind of spoiled for choice when we got this card because I didn't know quite what to do. There were so many different options, and it felt like a deck that really wanted to be Simic because it just feels like a Simic card, which, I mean, obviously it is, despite the fact that it's a mono green card. So we did decide to make this a Simic deck. And when I was looking through commanders, none of them really stuck out to me. This is where I kind of get to admit Simic is my least favorite 2-color pairing. It just feels like everything kind of does the same thing to me, and I wanted something that felt unique. And so the card that I eventually saw that caught my eye was Lonis Genetics Expert, a relatively new card from the Clue set. It's 1 and a hybrid green-blue, for a 1/2 legendary creature snake elf detective. It also has Evolve. So whenever a creature enters the battlefield under our control, again, if that has greater power or toughness, we put a +1/+1 counter on it. And then whenever one or more +1/+1 counters are put on Lonis, investigate that many times, so we get to make that many clues. And whenever we sacrifice a clue, we put a +1/+1 counter on another creature we control. So, like I said, there's still a lot going on here, and it is very Simic. It wants to draw cards, it wants to put counters on things. But the reason that drew me to this is, of course, the fact that it has Evolved, very similar to Experiment 1, but it also deals with clues, which is not something that you typically see in just the Simic colors. Lonis tends to be the go-to for that. But I wanted to dig a little bit deeper on this deck in particular, and so I realized, having picked Experiment 1 and having picked Lonis, both of those cards have the Simic watermark. That's the little Simic symbol on the text box of the card. So I figured, what if every single card that we put in this deck has the Simic symbol on it? We make this deck as Simic as possible and make sure that every single card is from the Simic Guild. Not just the Simic colors, not just things that deal with +1/+1 counters. They have to have the Simic symbol to be eligible to be in this deck. So there are going to be a lot of unique choices, as we'll see as we go through this deck. But the main thing that's actually going to impact is I am using very specific printings of the cards in this deck, and that is something we don't normally do. Typically, when I'm building these decks, I only look at the cheapest version of each card because I want the budget to be as cheap as possible. We are not doing that with this deck. If there is a version of a card that is cheaper but does not have the Simic watermark, we have to use the one that is more expensive and has the Simic watermark. So, with all of those qualifications out of the way, let's move on to some of our themes for this deck and break down how this is actually going to work. So the easiest way I could describe the themes is that they are the Simic themes. So, for example, our first one is Evolve, which we've already talked about with Experiment 1 and with Lonis. This wants us to play bigger creatures to then make our smaller creatures even bigger. And so to that end, we have something like Croconura, which is 2 and a green for a 1/3 crocodile frog. It's got reach and Evolve. The nice thing about Evolve is that it deals with both power and toughness. So because Croconura is a 1/3, If we played a 1/4, it would still get bigger, or if we played a 2/2, it would still get bigger. As long as power or toughness is bigger, then it will grow the creature that has Evolve. And so since we're playing the Simic theme of Evolve, you might notice we are also playing the Simic theme of Adapt. So Adapt was the most recent Simic theme, and we can see it in play on something like Sauriform Hybrid, which is 1 and a green for a 2/2 human lizard warrior, and it has Adapt 4 for 4 green, which means we can pay 6 total mana and then put 4 +1/+1 counters on it. Now, this card in particular is not very exciting. It's a 2 mana 2/2 that can become an 8 mana 6/6, and while that's not super great, in this deck, when we're caring about +1/+1 counters in the way that we are, Sauriform Hybrid is great because it means that we can play it early and still get value out of it in the late game, and probably get more value out of it than it looks. But if we've got Evolve and we've got Adapt, then of course we have the third Simic Hybrid theme. I'm sure people already know what it is. We'll give you a second if you don't, but it is Graft. So Graft is going to be the final Simic theme for this deck, and it is going to be, well, something that's a little bit unique to what we're doing, because a lot of the Graft creatures have abilities that care about +1/+1 counters, so we kind of get to double dip on a lot of the Graft creatures, which is very important for what we're trying to do. And so a great example of that is Cytospawn Shambler, which is 6 and a green for a 0/0 elemental mutant, but it does have Graft 6, which means that it enters with 6 +1/+1 counters, and whenever another creature comes into play, we can move a +1/+1 counter from this creature onto the creature that came into play, and we can pay a green to give target creature with a +1/+1 counter on it trample until the end of turn. Most of the time, we are going to be using this to pump up our team. So if we play the Shambler and then we play something like Krakenora, we could just move that counter over to Krakenora. We can then give things trample as long as they have counters on them. But this is also a way that we can kind of initiate some combat tricks, because neither Graft nor the ability on the Cytospawn Shambler care about the creature being ours. We can use this on other people's creatures to push through damage on other people. Maybe they need some trample, we can give them trample. Maybe an opponent just needs to get that extra +1 damage, so if we move a counter over, they can take someone else out or block something effectively. This is going to be a great political tool as we play through the game, but it's also going to be something that benefits our board state more than our opponents. So this is what we are built around. Quite literally, the Simic themes from every Ravnica set, because we are so Simic that it hurts. So with that out of the way, that kind of long-winded introduction to what this deck is all about, let's talk a little bit more about some of the actual cards in the deck, specifically highlighting some key cards. These are the cards that are sometimes win conditions, are sometimes value pieces, or are just very powerful in our specific deck. So the first of the key cards I want to talk about is Prime Speaker Zagana. And Prime Speaker Zagana is 2 green, blue for a 1/1 Merfolk Wizard. When she enters the battlefield, she gets X +1/+1 counters, where X is the greatest power among other creatures you control. And when it enters the battlefield, draw cards equal to its power. So if we have a 5/5 creature, which is definitely not out of the ordinary considering how many +1/+1 counters we have, Zagana would come in with 5 +1/+1 counters, and then, because she's now a 6/6, we would draw 6 cards. So it doesn't seem like much on the front end. A 6 mana 1/1 is definitely not what we want, but considering we are playing so many big creatures and so many creatures that get +1/+1 counters, there's a very good chance that when this enters the battlefield, it's drawing 5 or more cards. And as an absolute worst case scenario, even if she gets no +1/+1 counters because she's the only creature we have in play, she still comes in with 1 power and still draws us 1 card, so she would at least replace herself, and I know that's definitely not what we want. That's not the best case scenario by any means, but it's at least something. So moving on then from Prime Speaker Zagana, next up we have Fathom Mage, another card draw engine, this one more strategic as the game goes on, less burst in the way that Zagana is. So Fathom Mage is 2 green blue for a 1/1 human wizard. She has Evolve, and whenever a +1/+1 counter is put on Fathom Mage, you may draw a card. So this is going to be one of the most effective ways for us to draw cards over the course of the game, because we have a ton of cards that can move +1/+1 counters. We've got a lot of big creatures, so Evolve is going to be triggering pretty regularly. And Fathom Mage is going to be one of the most efficient card draw spells in the deck, because unlike Prime Speaker Zagana, who's going to draw maybe 5 cards immediately, she might draw 1 to 2 cards a turn, and that's going to go a lot less noticed by the rest of the table, because a lot of times if you draw 2 cards on your turn, and then 2 cards on the next turn, and 2 cards on the next turn, your opponents tend to not look at it too difficult. It's not that bad for them. But if you draw 5 cards in one turn, then your opponents are looking at you like you might be a problem because, well, let's be honest, you probably are. So that is what makes Fathom Mage so good. It's card draw, it's efficient, it's kind of under the radar, but it has nothing on our final key card in this list, because our final key card is the most efficient win condition in the entire deck, and that is Simic Ascendancy. So Simic Ascendancy is a green and a blue for an enchantment. You can pay 1 green blue, put a +1/+1 counter on target creature you control. Whenever 1 or more +1/+1 counters are put on a creature you control, put that many growth counters on Simic Ascendancy, and at the beginning of your upkeep, if Simic Ascendancy has 20 or more growth counters on it, you win the game. Now, this is a card that can get a little bit salty. I know there are some people that I've played with in the past that are not a big fan of just kind of the auto win cards, especially because with our deck, we are just playing our deck. We're putting creatures into play, they're getting counters. We're just kind of slowly ticking up Simic Ascendancy. And it's this idea that there's an inevitability on the table that like we will win the game if nobody deals with it. And I know that can be unfun in some play groups, so if that is not something you're looking for, then you can, of course, take out Simic Ascendancy. But if you're looking for a great way to win the game that's not through combat damage, this is really the only thing we've got that has a Simic watermark. And remember, that is the driving factor of our deck. And so there are times when maybe you just get shut down by a Spore Frog, which is the worst card in Magic, as we all know, or maybe people just have ways to interact with attackers or prevent you from attacking, and you need some other way to win. So because of that, I do highly recommend keeping Simic Ascendancy in the deck, but I do know that some people are not a big fan of it, so it's just kind of up to you and your play group. But with that being said, let's move on from our key cards into our cool interactions. And there's a couple of cool interactions that I really want to highlight, because I think that they really showcase how well a lot of these cards work together, because, you know, it's almost like they were all designed to be Simic-specific cards. But our first cool interaction is going to be between Biomass Mutation and Master Biomancer. So these two work in a unique way because it doesn't matter which one you play first, they're both going to benefit from what the other one is doing. So for example, Biomass Mutation is X and a hybrid green-blue. For an instant, creatures you control become XX until end of turn. Master Biomancer is 2 green-blue for a 2/4 elf wizard. Each other creature you control enters the battlefield with a number of additional +1/+1 counters on it equal to Master Biomancer's power, and is a mutant in addition to its other types. So if, for example, we cast Biomass Mutation first, maybe we make all of our creatures into 5/5s, now Master Biomancer is a 5/5 creature, so any other creatures we play that turn are going to enter with 5 +1/+1 counters. So we probably couldn't play as many creatures as we would have otherwise, but we can probably get down 1 or 2, and now they are much bigger and can make a lot more of an impact on the game. And if it's something like, say, Fathom Mage, she would enter with those 5 counters, seeing all of those counters get put on her, and would then draw us 5 cards. But we can also actually do this in reverse by casting Master Biomancer first. If we cast the Biomancer first, then all of our creatures are entering with 2 +1/+1 counters, since it has a power of 2, but Biomass Mutation specifically changes the base power and toughness of the creatures, which means that if we have a 1/1 that has 2 +1/+1 counters on it, it would be a 3/3. But if we say biomass mutation for x equals 5, that 1/1 is now a 5/5, but it still has the 2 counters on it, making it a 7/7. So we can effectively grow our team much, much larger than our opponents are expecting. And because biomass mutation is an instant, we can actually do it after blocks have been declared, because our opponents might be expecting to get hit for like 9 damage, and then all of a sudden we hit them for, say, 27 instead. So it can really change the course of combat, and it really makes it so that our opponents don't know what's going on at any given time. And it's a great finisher because we can kind of build up a board state and then swing out and cast this giant biomass mutation. So that is going to be cool interaction number 1. And something that actually plays pretty well with cool interaction number 1 is going to be cool interaction number 2, because this is going to be the only infinite combo in the entire deck, as far as I'm aware, and that is just using Simic watermarks. So the way that this works is we have Incubation Druid, which is 1 and a green for a 0/2 elf druid. It can tap to add 1 mana of any type that a land you control could produce. But if Incubation Druid has a +1/+1 counter on it, you add 3 mana of that type instead. Then it also has Adapt 3 for 3 green. So it taps for 1 mana, but if it just has any +1/+1 counters on it, now it's tapping for 3 mana. And that's relevant because we have the Vigian Graft Mage, which is 2 and a blue, for a Vidalcan Wizard Mutant. It's a 0/0 with Graft 2. And you can pay 1 and a blue to untap target creature with a +1/+1 counter on it. So I'm sure you can kind of see how this works. If we have a counter on Incubation Druid, she can tap for 3 blue mana, and then the Vigian Graft Mage can use 2 of that blue mana to untap the Incubation Druid. So we are now positive 1 mana and have done technically nothing. So we can tap and untap the Incubation Druid as many times as we want, and as long as we have blue mana to untap it, we're good. So we can then use that floating blue mana. She can tap for green, then we can use the blue to untap it. Now we have 2 green floating, and we can kind of repeat this process and quite literally make infinite mana of both green and blue to do whatever we want with. And that is the point when using something like biomass mutation, which we just talked about, for x equals, say, 1 billion, to make all of our creatures' power and toughness 1 billion, we can just win the game pretty effectively and kind of out of nowhere, although I guess it's not fully out of nowhere. People can see this coming. The only way it's fully out of nowhere is if we have Incubation Druid ready to go, a bunch of mana, then we play the Graft Mage, because then we can just start the loop and immediately go off. But like I said earlier with Simic Ascendancy, if your playgroup is not a big fan of infinite combos, this is one that's very easy to remove. However, I do think it's worth including, especially because the deck has that limit of only playing the Simic watermark cards. I think that having this is kind of like a fluke more than anything else, less so of a design. It's more of like a design flaw that just happens to work in our favor. But I think it's cool. If your playgroup is not a fan, then, take it out. But that will lead us to the end of our deck tech, and so the last thing we're going to have to do for our deck tech is take a look at the budget. And this week, reminder, we are using specific printings of the cards. That means that we have to play the cards with the Simic watermarks, even if they're more expensive. And with that being said, our total budget this week still came out to only $47.22, which is less than half of our total budget limit, with the most expensive card being Cytoplast Manipulator, other than, of course, Lonis, but we don't typically count commanders for this, because it is 2 blue for a 0/0 Human Wizard Mutant, Graft 2, pay a blue and tap it to gain control of target creature with a +1/+1 counter on it, as long as Cytoplast Manipulator remains in play. So a theft effect that can technically be permanent is very, very powerful. And because of all of our graft cards, we can very easily just put counters on our opponent's things and then take them. So I understand why Cytoplast Manipulator has the price tag that she has. If you did need to trim her down for budget purposes, you certainly could. But before we actually get to the next piece of this, I do want to mention that I took the time to look at what this deck would be if we did use all of the cheapest prices. So right now, The $47 is what the deck is with all the Simic watermarks. If you want the deck as is, but don't care specifically about the cards having the watermarks, then you can actually get this deck for $20 less at about $27.10. And as weird as this sounds, most of that actually comes from the basic lands, because the basic lands typically don't have watermarks on them, but in one of the Ravnica sets, there were basic lands that were specifically designed for each guild that have the watermark of the guild on them, and so those are the ones we have to be playing, even though they're about 40 cents each rather than about 3 cents each. So it really drags down the price of the deck when we can take those out and replace them with normal basic lands. The same goes for a couple of other cards that might be $2 to $3 with the watermark and maybe like 30 cents without it. So if you did want to pick up the deck, it is very cheap. It is just a little bit off theme if that's something you want to do. Now, with that being said, I do have a suggestion for you if you want to increase the price of the deck, and unfortunately, also take it a bit off theme. Obviously, I did the best I could with the theme cards, but if you wanted to make the deck more powerful and you don't specifically care about the theme, then I would recommend putting in Polywog Prodigy, which is a massive $18.71, and taking out Simic Initiate, which is only 8 cents. So the Polywog is 1 in a blue for a 1/3 frog wizard. It has evolved, so it is on theme. It's just unfortunately not a Simic card. But whenever an opponent casts a non-creature spell with mana value less than Polywog Prodigy's power, draw a card. So again, this is a huge card draw engine, especially if we can get it really big, which in this deck is very easy to do. And so, of course, if we're putting a card in, we got to take a card out. And I think Simic Initiate, which is just 1 green for a 0/0 human mutant and graft 1, is unfortunately the card that has to take the hit. Because even though this is not terrible, it has one of our abilities, it's got graft, it cares about +1/+1 counters. It is, for all intents and purposes, just a 1 mana 1/1. That's not going to get us very far in Commander, unfortunately. And so a 2 mana 1/3 that can grow and also draw cards is going to be quite a bit better in the long run, but it is off theme. As you can see, there is no Simic watermark, so that automatically makes it worse for this deck, but that is something to consider. However, that is the entirety of our deck tech for this week, and before we get into the game, because of course we got to see how this deck functions, I want to take a second to highlight some of the ways that you can help support the channel if that's something you're interested in doing. You can follow me over on Twitter, find me on Reddit, send me an email. If you ever have suggestions for cards you would like to see built around, those are some of the best ways to send them to me, as of course is just commenting on the video. Other than that, I would appreciate it if everyone would like the video and subscribe to the channel. That does help out quite a bit. I'm really trying to get our videos seen by more people, and liking them gets them out more to people that may be interested. So please be doing that. Share them with your friends if you can. And if you're interested in going above and beyond and supporting us over on Patreon, you can, patreon.com/dungeonlearnersguide. And right here on YouTube, there is a link in the channel description and the video description to the channel memberships where you can get the same things as on Patreon. It's things like joining our Discord so we can brew up the decks together. You can play in the games and beyond the channel. You get the deck lists a week early. You get the guarantee that any of your suggestions will be made into videos at some point, and a bunch of other cool stuff. So if that's something you're interested in, you can definitely check those out. And then, of course, I got to give a shout out to all of our current patrons and channel members, such as William Swiftfoot, Doodle, Eric Hui, Jeff Winger, Jeffrey Boos, Salty and Sunshine, Tyler Esme, Sven Van Nimwegen, Patty Wack, Devin Purser, Brian Haney, Keegan Tawney, and Elias Metza. So to all of you, thank you all so much for all of your support. And without any further ado, let's see how our deck performs in a game. So this week we're going to be joined by 3 opponents, and that is going to be Luke playing Yargle and Multani, Doodle playing Edgar Markov, and then we have Richard playing Rhoda Geist Avenger and Timon Youthful Geist. So starting off with Luke and his Yargle and Multani deck, You may have seen this deck before, but more likely you've probably seen Luke's Multani deck, which is a mono-green version of pretty much the same thing, where he just wants to draw a ton of cards, make a giant creature, and then smack people with it. This one is very unique in the sense that Yargle and Multani with 18 power just needs a giant growth effect, a +3/+3, to make it within lethal commander damage. So I have no doubt that his deck is filled with those kind of effects. He really just wants to slam a giant creature into his opponents, and I am very excited for it. I absolutely love Yargle and Multani. I would love to build my own deck around them someday. One of my personal favorite decks I have is a mono black Yargle Voltron deck. So this is a card that is very near and dear to my heart and my playstyle. So I am super excited to see what it can do. Next up, we have Doodle playing Edgar Markov, and this is Doodle's attempt to power down an incredibly powerful commander. I'm sure we all know that Edgar Markov is incredibly strong at a commander table, being able to just swarm the deck with a bunch of vampires and being able to just kind of generate value out of nowhere. But Doodle limited himself by only being able to play legendary vampires. And while that's not necessarily a huge hit because Edgar is still incredibly strong, it at least means that he's not going to have as many synergies as he would if he could play any vampire. So we'll see if that actually makes a difference and powers down Edgar, or if it's still just an Edgar Markov deck that we definitely got to focus on. And then last but not least, we have Richard playing Rhoda and Timon, and this is a tap your stuff kind of deck. So Rhoda is going to get bigger whenever things are tapped, and then Timon is going to allow him to tap creatures each combat. So he really wants to just make sure that his opponents can't do much with their creatures. I imagine that's not going to go well for any of the creature decks that he's playing against this week. So we will see how that goes. I think if I have to pick one of these decks that I'm the most concerned about, it is probably the Rhoda and Timon deck, because we really need our creatures to be able to win the game. We need to be able to push through combat damage and start swinging our creatures, and a lot of them have tap abilities. So being able to tap down our creatures is really going to limit what we can do, and I imagine the same is probably true for Yargle and Multani and Edgar as well. So this may turn into a 3v1 situation depending on how quick Richard's able to get his tap effects out. But either way, I am very excited to see how this game goes. So please do let me know down in the comments who you think is going to win. Get your predictions in now. And I hope you like the deck tech. Hope you will like the game. I'm sure I certainly will. And I will talk to you all once it's done. At the start of the game, Luke goes first, followed by myself, Doodle, and then Richard. On Luke's first turn, he plays a Verdant Catacombs, sacrificing it and losing a life to search his library for an underground mortuary, putting it into play and surveilling one. I play a Forest. Doodle plays a Temple of Silence, scrying one. Richard plays an Irrigated Farmland. Luke plays a Rogue's Passage and casts Sakura Tribe Elder. I play an island and cast Simic Signet. Doodle plays a command tower and casts Talisman of Indulgence. Richard plays a Plains, casts Arcane Signet, then at the end of turn, Luke sacrifices Sakura Tribe Elder to search his library for a basic land, putting it into play tapped. Then on Luke's turn, he plays an Overgrown Tomb untapped, paying 2 life, and casts Goreclaw, Terror of Calcisma, making his creatures with power 4 or greater cost 2 less to cast, and also giving each creature he controls with power 4 or greater +1/+1 and trample whenever Goreclaw attacks. On my turn, I play a Forest and cast Gyre Engineer, which can tap for 2 mana. On Doodle's turn, he cast Varric Warped Sengir, letting him pay life equal to the life he would pay to activate an ability to copy that ability. This also makes him a 1/1 vampire token thanks to Edgar's Eminence ability. Then he plays a Mines of Moria and passes. Richard plays an island and casts Blinding Mage, which can tap to tap target creature. Then he also casts Swiftfoot Boots. Luke casts his commander, Yargle and Multani, then attacks me for 4 with Goreclaw. On my turn, I play a Forest and cast my commander, Lonis, Genetics Expert, which has Evolve, lets me investigate whenever a counter is put on it, and lets me put a +1/+1 counter on another target creature whenever I sacrifice a clue. Then I cast Sporeback Troll, which has Graft 2, and allows me to pay 2 mana to regenerate a creature with a +1/+1 counter on it. This also triggers Evolve on Lonis, putting a +1/+1 counter on them and letting me investigate. On Doodle's turn, he plays a mountain and casts Vona, Butcher of Magan, making another vampire token, and letting him tap her and pay 7 life to destroy target non-land permanent. He then moves to combat and attacks Richard for 2 with Varric, gaining 2 life. Richard plays a Temple of Enlightenment, scrying 1, then casts Verity Circle, letting him draw a card whenever an opponent's creature becomes tapped while not being declared as an attacker. Luke casts Demonic Embrace, enchanting Yargle and Multani, giving them +3/+1 in flying. This lets him attack Doodle with Yargle and Multani for exactly 21 commander damage, knocking him out of the game. On my turn, I play an island and cast Helium Squirter, which has Graft 3 and allows me to pay 1 mana to give a creature with a +1/+1 counter flying until the end of turn. This also triggers Evolve on Lonis, putting a +1/+1 counter on them and letting me investigate. Then at the end of turn, Richard activates Blinding Mage to tap Luke's Goreclaw, also letting him draw a card. On Richard's turn, he plays a Glacial Fortress and casts his commander, Timon Youthful Geist, letting him tap up to 1 target creature at the beginning of each combat, and when he moves to combat this turn, he taps my Lonis, letting him draw a card. On Luke's turn, he casts Nature's Lore, searching his library for a basic land, putting it into play tapped. Then he also casts 3 Visits, searching his library for a Woodland Chasm, and putting it into play as tapped as well. When Luke moves to combat, Richard taps Yargle and Multani with Timon, drawing a card, and at the end of turn, I sacrifice a clue, drawing a card and putting a +1/+1 counter on Gyre Engineer. Then on my turn, I play an island, and I cast the card of the week, Experiment 1, which has Evolve and lets me remove 2 counters from it to regenerate it. I also cast Experiment Kraj, which can tap to put a +1/+1 counter on a creature, and has all activated abilities of creatures with +1/+1 counters. This also triggers Evolve for both Experiment 1 and Lonis, letting me investigate. Then when I move to combat, Richard taps down Lonis and draws a card. On Richard's turn, he plays the Gates of Istfell and casts Hilda of the Icy Crown, letting him pay 1 when he taps an opponent's creature to make a 4/4 elemental, put a +1/+1 counter on each creature he controls, or scry 2 and draw a card. When Richard moves to combat, he taps down my Helium Squirter, drawing a card, then attacks Luke for 3 with Timon. In his second main phase, he equips Timon with the Swiftfoot Boots, giving him both haste and hexproof. On Luke's turn, he casts Garruk Wildspeaker, immediately activating his -3 ability, killing the Planeswalker to draw cards equal to the greatest power among creatures he controls. In response, Richard casts Swords to Plowshares, exiling Yargle and Multani, letting Luke gain 21 life since their power was 21. Then, when Garruk's ability resolves, Luke draws 4 cards instead of 21. Once that has resolved though, Luke plays a Swamp, and when he moves to combat, Richard taps Goreclaw and draws a card. Then at the end of turn, I sacrifice a clue to draw a card and put a +1/+1 counter on Experiment 1. On my turn, I move straight to combat, and Richard taps down Lonis, but before the trigger can resolve, Luke casts Tear Asunder, exiling Verity Circle so that Richard doesn't draw a card. Then I attack Richard with my entire board of creatures for 14 total damage. Richard blocks the Helium Squirter with Hilda, but before the damage, I cast Biomass Mutation for X = 6, giving all my creatures base power and toughness 6/6. This means that Richard instead takes 30 damage, going to only 8 life. On Richard's turn, he plays a Plains and casts Sakashima of 1,000 Faces, entering as a copy of Timon and preventing the legend rule from applying to creatures he controls. Then he casts Benalish Trapper and Sigardian Priest, both of which can tap to tap another target creature. Luke plays a Swamp and recasts his commander, Yargle and Multani. Then when he moves to combat, he attacks me for 4 with Goreclaw. When I move to combat on my turn, Richard taps Lonis and Helium Squirter, but in response, I cast Simic Charm, giving all my creatures hexproof until the end of turn. Then I'm able to pay 5 total mana to give all 5 of my creatures with +1/+1 counters flying until the end of turn, using them to attack Richard for 14 total damage. He blocks Lonis and the Helium Squirter, letting through 7 damage, but before the damage I tap Kraj to put another counter on Experiment 1, doing exactly 8 damage to Richard and knocking him out of the game. This unfortunately means I have no blockers on Luke's turn, so he can cast Rancor, enchanting Yargle and Multani to give them +2/+0 and trample, before attacking me with both his Commander and Goreclaw, giving Yargle and Multani another +1/+1, hitting me for exactly 21 commander damage, knocking me out, and winning Luke the game. Alright, so that was a sweet game. Unfortunately, Doodle got knocked out pretty early on. He tapped his only flyer and allowed Luke to just kind of squeeze in that 21 commander damage. I think that there were a couple of things that went wrong on our point of view throughout the course of the game. Being able to tap our stuff down every single turn made Richard's deck very much the threat, and it kind of forced us to use everything we had to take him out. I was really banking on Luke not finding a way to kill us with Yargle and Multani that last turn when, of course, he did, because, you know, his whole deck is built around it. But in my mind, I was thinking that if Luke couldn't kill us that turn, then we had a pretty good shot of winning. Whereas if we let Richard continue to untap with that many tap effects, we really weren't going to do anything for the rest of the game, and it was just going to drag on, and there was nothing we could do while we kind of just sat there and got slowly pinged to death. And that wasn't a game I really wanted to see. I wanted to see Simic just start smacking people in the face. So I took the risky chance, didn't pay out, and of course Luke knocked us out with Yargle and Multani, but still a very sweet game. I had a ton of fun with the deck, which is kind of surprising because, like I said earlier, Simic is my least favorite color pair, but this deck was pretty fun, honestly. So overall, not too bad. Let me know down in the comments if there's any cards you'd like to see me build around in the future. Let me know what you thought of the deck. Are there any cards I should include or should not have included? I'd love to hear any comments. But other than that, thank you all so much for watching. Make sure you like the video, subscribe to the channel, and I will see you all on the other side of the Dungeon Learner's Guide.